So this is one of those lectures. So we're on behalf of both the organizations. I'm very happy to have you here. Thank you very much for your time. Um, I have prepared a brief introduction since I didn't know anything about the topic. I'm just going to read it out. But after the brief introduction, I would like to hand the floor over to you for your presentation. And then after that, we will go to the floor and open it up for question and answers. And in that time, during that time, when you have questions, perhaps you can also introduce yourselves so that we'll get to know each other a little better. So welcome once again. Dr. Ariana Maki holds a PhD in Buddhist art history and is currently serving as the 2025 US Fulbright Scholar to Bhutan. She is assistant professor in the Art and Design Department of the University of Idaho in the USA, where she teaches global art history as well as critical art historical methods and theories and visual culture. Dr. Maki's research focuses on the material and visual cultures that constitute the Buddhist world, particularly in Bhutan and the Himalaya. In addition to research on Himalayan art and architecture, she is involved with several collaborative digital humanities projects that provide increased access to and understanding of regional cultures. Dr. Maki is an occasional curator, primarily for museums associated with higher education, including most recently the Tang Teaching Museum of Skidmore College, Williams College Museum of Art, and the Loeb Art Center at Vassar College. Today, Dr. Maki will be talking about her recent research on the contributions of itinerant Nepali artists to Bhutan's surviving material record, focusing on sculptures. Right? Over to you, Dr. Maki.
Thank you so much. Namaskar, everyone, and good afternoon. It's an honor to be here with you today, and I'd like to extend my thanks to Amar and Vika of the Association of Nepalese and Himalayan Studies, Kathmandu Center, and to Martin Chautari for generously co-organizing this event. And many thanks to all of you for choosing to spend some time with us today. Can people in the back hear me all right? Okay. Thank you. It's really been wonderful to be back in Nepal after more than a decade of being away and meeting up with old friends as well as making new connections. So today I'm going to speak about some of the significant contributions of itinerant Newari Nepali artists to Bhutan's visual landscape during the 17th century. We'll focus primarily on three key individuals and three major monuments of Western Bhutan, Chakri, Pango, and Taksang, and the roles that these places and the images within them played in communicating messages of political and religious authority under the Drukpa Kagyu Buddhist traditions, leaders of which were seeking to establish greater levels of control over Western Bhutan. And further, we will see how patrons deliberately selected and named artists from Nepal as the makers of some of these works that helped support those claims to authority. The art history of Bhutan has not yet been written in any language, and this talk presents findings that are part of a broader project to produce a systemic art history of Bhutan. And what I'm sharing today draws primarily upon traditional Buddhist texts, the Pecha, and pioneering work by the historian Dr. John Arducy. Alongside a group of collaborators from Bhutan's central monastic body, or Jumdrasam, I'm analyzing historical texts associated with Buddhist masters to pull out and extract the names of patrons, the details of what they gave patronage for, the paintings, the sculptures, the murals, the ritual objects, the texts that were produced, the consecrations that were performed for those objects and those sites, and other salient information that we expect will flesh out the development of the region's art history. In the coming months, I and my collaborators, along with additional partners, will begin correlating, or trying to correlate, fingers crossed, the things that are mentioned in the text, as well as finding them in the extant collections and extant material records wherever possible. Now, while the roles of Newari Nepali artists in the arts of Nepal, Tibet, and other regions have been the focus of scores of publications by Paul, Kim, Bhattacharya, Thapa, Lama, Lewis, Bangel, and Brown, among many others. The contributions that itinerant artists made to Buddhist temples in Bhutan has been comparatively understudied. Thus, today's talk will focus on documented contributions made by artists from Nepal to the 17th century Bhutanese visual landscape and the ways in which the associated images and architecture serve to support the Drukpa Kagyu tradition as they sought to consolidate their power. The early 17th century marked the beginning of efforts of Tibetans from the Drukpa Kagyu to claim a greater level of control in what currently constitutes Bhutan. They first asserted themselves in the regions of Shar, Wang, and The, which are the modern Thimphu, Punakha, and Wangdi districts circled here on the map. At the time, the area had long been home to monasteries, temples, and pilgrimage destinations associated with several Buddhist traditions that originated in Tibet, some of which were established in Bhutan as early as the 13th and 14th centuries. For example, the Sakyapa, like Lading Gompa, colloquially referred to in the Paro region as Heidi Gompa, is located about 20 kilometers north of Paro town. Prior to the Drukpa Kagyu consolidation, this site was primarily Sakya, and it was used frequently as a stopping point for pilgrims, teachers, and students, as well as traders as they moved between Tibet and the Paro Valley. While a recent renovation was conducted during the height of the pandemic, much of the imagery inside the main temple no longer reflects this Sakyapa heritage. However, fortunately, the private owners of this temple decided to take down the canvas murals, roll them up while the renovation was going on, and store them. They also dismantled the very elaborate wooden carved throne backs that also show some remarkable parallels to Newari artistic tradition. And now they have placed them around the ground floor circumambulation path. So they are no longer in the space of main worship, but rather have been shifted out to the periphery so that those who are circumambulating will be able to encounter them. Now, that's an interesting movement, and we could talk about that as part of the Q&A. What they're talking about doing now is they want it to be a museum and a temple, and they want the Koram path, the circumambulatory path, to be a museum, while the inside, quote unquote, the word they used translates as real, the real temple would be reflected in the new renovations. In addition to the Sakyapa, the Drukpa Kagyu had a long-standing presence in the region. There are two sites associated with Tongtong Gyalpo, for example, Dumse Lakan, which you see on the top, which is located right near Paro town, and Pachot Lakan, which is on the way from Paro to Thimphu, nearing to the Chuzon confluence. These both were originally founded by Tongtong Gyalpo, also known as Chaksampa, who was part of the Drukpa Kagyu Buddhist tradition and who contributed several distinct teachings to the tradition's corpus. As well, the Drukpa Kagyu controlled several sites in northern Shuka, just south of the Chuzon complex, at least two of which still carry vestiges of their Drukpa origins, and that the specific form of ekajati depicted and propitiated there reflect Drukpa iconography. Specifically, whereas most forms of ekajati do have the one braid, the one eye, the one fang, and the one breast, the Drukpa tradition has only one leg. Mimas and other traditions who follow ekajati, every other form of her will have two legs, with the exception of those in the Drukpa. So while the imagery of all four of these sites reveals at least some clues to their respective sectarian origins, the visual environments now also incorporate Drukpa Kagyu iconography, reflecting the eventual successes achieved as the tradition prevailed. Traces of other traditions we know to be present in the region prior to the 17th century, such as the Barawa Kagyu, and as Ardusi points out, the Gelugpa farther afield in Merak, are much harder to find. It was the Gelugpa who were the Drukpa Kagyu's chief rivals during the 17th century, and as part of this rivalry that many artists from Nepal were given commissions and patronage in Bhutan. So to very briefly set the scene as to why did the Drukpa Kagyu even need to establish themselves in a new territory? What was driving that movement outwards from Tibet? The short version is it was a contested reincarnation. The seat of the Drukpa Kagyu was at Ralung Monastery in Tibet. After the passing of Ralung Throghonder Pema Karpo, a reincarnation was discovered, confirmed, and installed as the head, Shabdrung Ngawang Namgyal, who is a holder of the renowned Kya family lineage. Yet later, a second claimant, Patsam Mongpo, emerged, and he had the backing of the Sangye seat in central Tibet, where the Gelugpa was holding sway under the 5th Dalai Lama Lobsang Gyatso and the Gangam Prodang government. Volleys between the Shabdrung supporters and those of the rival claimant continued for many years, coming to a head in particular over a sacred image, a form of Karshapani Lokeshvara that was said to be found among the cremated remains of the Drukpa Kagyu lineage founder, Tsampa Gyari Dorji. Note that the image seen is said to be a Ramjun Karshapani, not the Ramjun Karshapani, and there are several Ramjun Karshapani, so I am just showing you one that was gifted to me by the internet by somebody who does visits Bhutanese sacred sites, just to give you an idea of what this relic looks like, not claiming that this is the actual one that is held in Punakha in Bhutan, which I and very few people would ever get to see. So the ferocity of this dispute over the relic and the rightful ownership and succession of the Ralung throne ultimately led Shabdrung and his supporters to leave Tibet in 1616 and head south into Bhutan, where the Drukpa had an established network of patrons and students and had had that network since the 13th century, when Pacho Drugom Jipo had been sent to the area to act as a missionary of sorts by Dharma Sengye, nephew of the Drukpa Kagyu Bandar Sampa Gyare, he of the relic-bearing vertebrae. Over the intervening centuries, Pajo's 4 sons and their descendants had founded and maintained temples in Sharwang and Du, and to which Drukpa students and teachers had traveled back and forth, and marriage alliances had also been built between Drukpas in what is now Bhutan and the Drukpas in Tibet. This network gave Shabdrung a soft landing place when he arrived, relic in hand, in 1616. The self-arisen Karshapani, along with a series of visions, would soon encourage Shabdrung to stay in the south and quite literally build a new state. For the first few years of his stay, from 1616 until the death of his father in 1619, the Shabdrung repurposed existing structures. He did not commission any new buildings at that time. In 1620, he had his first occasion to do this, a temple called Chakri, which would house the remains of his father, Yakten Benima, who had died the preceding year. According to Shabdrung's biography, authored by Tsangkenshin Pelden Jamso, the Kudung Choten inside, or the stupa holding his father's remains, was fashioned from pure silver by Mani, Mayang, Zatipala, Amipala, and Mangalatashi from Nepal. Individuals about whom we are provided no other details except for the fact that they came from Nepal. So the fact that they chose to mention we are getting these artists from Nepal is already signaling how important it is. It passes along that idea of quality workmanship that was established through Nepali and Newari art production in the centuries preceding this. Now, as a side note, one of the complications that we acknowledge in our project is how Nepali and Newari names appear in traditional Tibetan Buddhist texts. They are rendered phonetically, and the phoneticization of it is not always as precise. And the people who are doing these writings seem not to know either the Nepali or Newari languages. So those with deep knowledge of local artisan tradition lineages here in Nepal, some of whom I hope are listening here, you may very well recognize these names. You may well see hints that I, as somebody who does not specialize in Nepal, would not be able to see. And in that note, I welcome learning any new information about them, as well as finding ways to collaborate more fully on this and the broader project. Now, as Ardusi notes, Shadrum's assemblage of these artisans seems to be reflective of a deliberate, longer-standing pattern of inviting, quote, skilled Newar artisans from Nepal and Tibet, quote, with generous salaries to create specific works. I maintain that Shadrum's choice to do this for the very first building project, one that houses the relics of his father, likely reflects three interests. First, like Shadrum himself, his father was a member of the well-established Gya family lineage of central Tibet, and sponsoring a repository crafted from pure silver would honor his late father's high status. Second, though time didn't really permit me in the scene setting to go into the details, just like his son Shadrum, Yabtempe Nima had also experienced visions that helped to compel Shadrum to stay in the south and not to return to Tibet, a decision so important that Shadrum wanted to honor his father's role through the construction of a beautifully made silver stupa of the highest quality. Third, employing master artists from Nepal to do this using the recognizable and established visual language that mirrors that of important monuments in their Tibetan homeland, essentially recreates the visual environment of his and his father's shared Tibetan home in what they envisioned as a new Ralum, a new seat of Drukpa Kagyu authority. I'm having to choose as to whether I can see my notes or whether I can see you all, and so I may be taking my glasses off and off. After the completion of Chakri, Shadrum begins a larger building program. Faced with ongoing pressure from the Tibetan forces to the north, he first builds a fortress, or dzong, at Simtoka. Textual accounts state that its physical form was made to look like Tibet's Ralum, but on a smaller scale. However, without knowing what contemporaneous accounts of what Ralum looked like at the time, it's difficult to confirm that statement. This comparatively massive project brought the attention of Shadrum's detractors, who regularly disrupted the building process, water supply, and led physical attacks on the workers. Tibetan forces successfully accessed and occupied the Simtoka zone for some time, and Shadrum very quickly, after Simtoka's completion, shifted his attention to the more easily defensible Punaka, where he began building a second fortress from which to administer the region. A third zone, Wangdi Podrong, followed soon after. This shows the scale and scope and ambitiousness of Shadrum's activities, building these massive fortresses in each of the three regions associated with Drukpa Kagyu history to that point, Sharwam and Thu, or Tembu, Punaka, and Wangdi. As Ardusi notes, the Shadrum opened up many trade missions on the frontiers with India, Nepal, and Tibet, naming Dewangiri, Tatseka, and Daklinka, with Punaka in the center. An interconnectedness of trade and transport also attested to in accounts from Jesuit missionaries who visited Bhutan in 1627. Despite this active interest in developing trade posts and likely the tax revenue that they generated, Shadrum continued to face ongoing military incursions by Tibetan forces. And while in 1641 the rival claimant to the throne in Tibet, Ralum, died, the war with the Gelugpas did not end. Between 1646 and 1649, the fighting was both physical, with Tibetan battalions coming south over the mountains in Paro, Punaka, and Wangdi for skirmishes on the ground, as well as ritual, with Shadrum conducting wrathful activities that invoked harm upon his enemies, while his foes in Lhasas, Gad, and Podrong were doing the same. Imagery associated with these activities appeared in the Gunghang, or wrathful deity shrine, of Wangdi Podrong Dzong, where murals of Shadrum specifically conducting these aggressive practices through the agency, through the identification with Mahakala or Yeshigumpo, to ritually direct Mahakala's destructive capacity towards the Tibetan military forces, towards the Ganden Podrong government, and also towards obstacles that he faced within Bhutan. Unfortunately, those murals are no longer extant because the entire Wangdi Podrong Dzong burnt down in 2012. However, there are these and a select other photographs remaining. So During these Tibetan wars, Shabdrung also conducted rituals at Tatsang, where alongside his Nyingmapa teacher, Terten Rigdzin Nimpo, Shabdrung first performed a series of rituals called the Kage Gongbu to achieve victory. The biography of the fourth Drukdesi Tenzin Rabge notes that when these rituals at Tatsang met with success, Shabdrung said, "I want to build a victory temple here at Tatsang," but he died before he was able to do that. The biography notes that upon the Tibetans' loss, Aganden Podran seized Ralu and confiscated its remaining contents. So, as an art historian, I need to apologize for the quality of the image at the top right of the screen. It is the only image that I could find of the third Druk Desi, also through a pilgrimage maker online. And so I just feel, because of its low resolution, there's something inside me that cannot bear to let it pass unnoted. So apologies for that low quality image. Now, turning to our second of the three personalities, Shabdrung the first and the second being the third Druk Desi, he had been born in Tibet to the Minkyu family, beginning life as a monk, but by the time he assumed a high-ranking position, administrative post under the Shabdrung, he used military means after the Shabdrung's concealment to bring basically all of eastern Bhutan under Drukpa rule by 1655. He built an astounding 8 fortresses, some of which are shown here. I didn't show all of them because the map was simply getting a little crowded. He built in Chongsa, in Jakar, in Hunsi, Jakar is in Bhutan, in Tashigangse, as well as Jemegang, Dunsamkar, Dzongkha, and elsewhere. In addition, he is credited with sponsoring images for temples throughout these newly conquered and converted regions, including at least one sculpture credited to Patsan Dewa, a Newari who appears as the artist behind several key commissions, as we will see. Before sharing additional details about his name, I'd like to point out that by the third Druk Desi, establishing these large, centralized, and fortified monuments across central and eastern Bhutan, he's expanding and embedding a visual Drukpa Kagyu language and the associated authority of it upon the physical landscape. And Mingyur Timpa, the third Druk Desi, also commissioned high-quality images by skilled artists to be placed not only in the completed zones, these new fortresses, but also in important communities that contributed, all of which contributed to the visual language authority. One extant example is a sculpture of Padmasambhava located in Ura, Bhutan, which was offered to the temple by Mingyur Timpa. Ura has been the long-standing seat of Nyingma and Drukpa Kagyu lineages, and accordingly, they were important to bring under the umbrella of broader Drukpa control, even though they were allowed to maintain their lineages and practices. So how do we find this name? Turning to the names of this one and 2 other sculptors, we find mention in the biography of the 4th Druk Desi, Tenzin Rabge, that for a series of projects, quote, "From Nepal were brought the most skilled artisans, Huam Patsan Dewa and Dung Dharmashri, Trawa Dharmadewa, and many other artisans. They began in the year of the dragon and worked for 2.5 years, finishing in the earth serpent year," end quote. Now, the Tibetan here leads to some questions. The part Dung Dharmashri of Dung Dharmashri means striking, so that may well reference metalsmithing. However, Pulwa usually means expel or push, and Trawa can mean fine or thin, the equivalent of the Sanskrit sukshma. I've encountered neither of these terms, Pulwa or Trawa, as generally used with artists, and standard dictionaries have not yet yielded any additional clues. Patsan Deva is referenced elsewhere in some like online resources. They'll say Pancha Deva or Panchen Deva. However, here it's pretty clear that it says Patsan, Patsan Deva. So I speculate whether it could be related to, are they saying Patan Deva? are they talking about somebody coming from Bhutan, either as a name or an epithet that references the individual's home area? I'm very eager to hear any suggestions from the members of the audience. As we turn more attention to Tenzin Rabgye, the last of our three individuals, you may recall that this was the person present at Paro Tatsang when the Shabdrung's rituals against the Tibetans, performed alongside his Nyingma teacher, were successful, and the Shabdrung said, "I wish I could build a victory temple here at Tatsang," a wish that went unfulfilled. Tenzin Rabgye took up that charge and many other state-building efforts after the death of the Shabdrung. Considered a relative of sorts of the Shabdrung, Tenzin Rabgye's mother had previously been a consort of the Shabdrung, and Tenzin Rabgye was a direct descendant of Drukpa Kunle, an important 15th century figure, and in later literature is even alluded to as an incarnation of Padmasambhava. Tenzin Rabgye was working very vigorously to further consolidate Drukpa authority. As much as his predecessor, the third Desi, had focused on territorial expansion through military means, Tenzin Rabgye was working differently, drawing on religious and ritual practices to solidify power. So 7 of the key ways that he did this were diplomacy, reducing tensions within and outside the region, implementing a standard religious calendar based on the one developed by Pema Karpo at Rawlung in Tibet, who you may remember was the previous incarnation of Shabdrung, integrating rituals and commentaries from the Nyingma Buddhist tradition, which held sway over much of the center and east of the country. Fourth, he sent a monk from Bhutan into Tibet to learn the festival dances as they were performed there, after which Tenzin Rabgye designed a system for Bhutan. Those celebrations, which then created a sense of community identity. And fifth, he instituted a monk tax, where one son from each family in central Bhutan had to become a monk, building potential or personal interconnections that then hopefully would reduce the potential for conflict. Sixth, he renovated Buddhist institutions in western Bhutan, such as Kichu, which dates to Songtsen Gampo's time, Tachogang, which was mentioned previously as a Drukpa Kagyu site, Dranyeka and Lamrigang, so that the imagery inside matched Drukpa Kagyu traditions and practices. And finally, he served as a major patron of the arts, supporting the creation of massive appliques called tongdro or boku in Tibetan, sculptures, tangka, and murals, all of which are focusing primarily on Drukpa Kagyu imagery with some Nyingma elements also. So turning to the Tenzin Rabgye's efforts at Tatsang, Tatsang, as many of you know, is a site associated with the 8th century Indian Taktik master and his consort, considered one of the locations where Padmasambhava manifested in order to subjugate forces that were serving as obstacles to Buddhism. And in addition, it's a site of concealed and revealed treasure teachings. In fact, both Tongtong Gyalpo and Pachadrupam Jipo are said to have revealed treasure there. And as we heard with the Shabdrung, it was a site for ritual and contemplative practices as well. Now, taking it upon himself to fulfill Shabdrung's wish for a temple to be built around the cliffside cave, Tenzin Rabgye directed those 3 aforementioned Newar artisans, Pulwa Patsan Dewa, Dundharma Shri, and Trawa Dharmadeva, to create the works within the temple of the 8 manifestations of Padmasambhava, or Guru Sengye. Patsan Dewa is also credited with a set of ritual daggers, image of which you see on the right, and a speaking statue, Sumjoma, an image of which you see on the left. Patsan Dewa created the sculpture, the speaking sculpture that is on the left in Punaka, which is several days away, and according to oral tradition, it was carried from there to the gateway of Tatsang, sort of where you start getting to the steep part, and at which point the sculpture said, "Don't worry, someone's going to come and pick me up and get me there," and the local guardian appeared in human form to carry it. Now, unfortunately, the imagery from the 8 manifestations temple was completely destroyed in the catastrophic fire of 1998. However, the set of daggers and speaking statue were rescued undamaged. They were likewise untouched in the previous 1951 fire. Stylistically, if we compare the sculpture at Ura, so you see two views of the sculpture at Ura, note the big difference between how they look. One is, shown with flash lighting at an oblique angle. The other is frontal with natural lighting. And then this one is the guru, the speaking guru from Tatsang. So stylistically, if we compare the sculpture at Ura with the speaking sculpture from Tatsang, you see several points of stylistic and technical similarity. For example, the fluttering stars around the base of the feather that surmounts his crown, the tri-lobed components of the frontal panel of the crown, the proportion between forehead, eyes, and eyebrows, the slight protrusion of the chin, the style of the ears, including his long incisions in the lobes, the rendering of the katvanga, or the tantric staff that's over his shoulder, and the way that the scarf is tied around both of them, all of which point to very similar workmanship, either by the same individual or individuals working closely together. So turning now from our second site, Tatsang, to our third site, Tangoshedra, which is located north of Thimphu City. So Gyaltse Tenzin Rabgye, the fourth Druk Desi, built an elaborate structure near to a meditation cave that had been the site where Drukpa Kagyu masters, including Pajo Drupal, the first Drukpa Kagyu to really consolidate some authority in the region, Shadrun's father Yabtumbe Nima, and Shadrun Namgyal, all three of them had important visions of deities that they interpreted as encouraging them to stay and establishing themselves in the region during their respective centuries. That cave was later enclosed, as you can see here, and it's around the corner from that this large structure was built by fourth Druk Desi Tenzin Rabgye. With his ambitious structure, Tenzin Rabgye instructed builders to make a central tower of 3 levels. Each of the 3 levels corresponds to one of the 3 bodies that is in Buddhism, that is the Tuku, or manifestation body, accessible in the world, the Longku, an emanation body that's accessible to meditation and visualization, and the Chuku, the highest most, which is essentially enlightenment. Though understood to be formless in nature, or arupadhatu, the Chuku is nonetheless frequently represented in the Himalayan Buddhist imagery as an illustration of the apex or height of accomplishment. So if we were to go inside this utse, inside this tower together, what we will see on the ground floor is an image of Shakyamuni. On the first floor is forearm Chaturbuja Avalokiteshvara, and on the second floor is Amitayus. So all 3 of these are also attributed to Panchen Dewa. The Shakyamuni they're all made from gold and gilt metal. They each serve as the main image on their respective floors. So Tuku, Longku, Chuku, Nirmanakaya, Sambhogakaya, and Dharmakaya. And alongside these works, around them, are images that are made by Tibetan and Bhutanese artists. So despite the political and military conflicts with Tibet at the time, Tibetan artists were still being invited to produce images for this very important site, as well as the artists from Nepal and the local Bhutanese. Some of the images that include, for example, on the ground floor, you have Buddha of the past, 8 bodhisattvas, going upstairs to the Longpu, and then upstairs to the highest most point. Each of these images by Panchen Deva is said to be really important. According Ardisi notes in an essay for The Dragon's Gift, quote, the Tango Karchak, or sort of list of contents, lists many precious spiritual relics of former Kagyu masters that were embedded in the large sculpted images, including bone fragments of Marpa, bits of clothing once belonging to Milarepa, Gampopa's locks of hair, and a painting, a tanka said to have been painted by Drukpa Kunle. So they are taking physical remains of past masters who were important in Tibet and in the formulation and dissemination of the Kagyu traditions, and placing them inside of these figures all throughout the central temple of this place. So in that way, they are taking Tibetan history and the Tibetan religious significance, and they are reifying it inside of a Bhutanese sacred landscape. So in conclusion, while myriad contributions of Newar and Nepali artists to the arts of Tibet and Nepal are getting attention, they still deserve additional scholarly attention and respect. But there are also places like Bhutan where we have, this is just looking at basically one page to find out information about their roles in Bhutan. We can see how Newar artists are contributing to the Bhutanese visual landscape, to the Drukpa Kagyu Bhutanese landscape in the 17th century in terms of memory, governance, and ritual. Memory by establishing Shabdrung's vision, memory of military victories, governance and new images and buildings in the center and east, gifts being given to strategically important sites, and ritual, the role in renovating and constructing new sites that reflect primarily Drukpa Kagyu practices, incorporating these images into important festivals and displays, and that use and pay respect to these works on a very regular basis. This includes creating the anchor images that help lead individuals to higher levels of realization. So with that, I think I've reached my time, and I just want to say thank you so much for your time and attention, and look forward to hearing any questions you might have and comments.
Thank you very much, Ariana. That was fascinating. So the floor is now open for questions, comments, discussions. We have until 4:30.
Yeah.
We have until 4:30, so plenty of time. Please go ahead. Can you please introduce yourself and ask your
Naresh
question?
Sakhe. I'm the founder principal of Aksheswar Traditional Buddhist Art College. So we teach traditional art. Students make these images. So it's very, very thoughtful and very useful for Nepalese. The Nepalese artists for hundreds of years have traveled to almost all parts of Asia, and your effort of finding some of the finest artwork in Bhutan is really appreciable. Statues are in places because they are metal. So I just am curious about, because you are exploring Bhutan and you must have been to many monasteries. I was just curious. Most of the painting tradition here in Nepal, we don't have that old painting because we also have similar problems like Bhutan. Like we have earthquakes, so we don't have mural paintings. So I am curious on your process of visiting these monasteries. I have also visited some of them, but because you are staying longer, I know you have stayed there very long. So wanted to know if there are some similar, same time aged mural paintings done by Newar artists.
I have yet to find murals that are attributed to Newar artists. I'm thinking specifically of just how important to understanding regional interconnectivity the murals at Shalu in Tibet are. And I'm hoping to find something like that really brings together the interactions that were taking place. One place where I would speculate there could be some connection would be at the site of Tanjing Lakang, which is in central Bhutan, which is in Jakar Valley, just across the river from Kurje. If we look carefully, there has been significant overpainting in the intervening centuries since 1505, when the paintings were consecrated. But there are these sort of interstitial elements in between different scenes or different figures who are sitting there, where we have the base at the bottom, that element coming up. And that is something that seems to catch hold from Newar's active for Sakya patrons in 14th and 15th centuries, and it seems to have, Pema Lingpa, the founder of Tanjung Lapang, went to Tibet 22 times in his life, and so I can't say whether he saw something or whether it was the Tibetan artists that he hired to paint that part of the monastery who had seen something and they brought it with them. There isn't a mention in his biography when they're talking about the creation that says, we were thinking about Sakya when we did this, or we were thinking about Nepal when we did this. But he does list that he brought the painters and the paint itself, the mineral pigments themselves, from Tibet. And so very clearly that visual idiom is coming along with them that I think we could say has potential roots in Nepal's traditions and their contributions in central Tibet, so sort of more diffuse. I will keep looking though. There are 2,000 monasteries. I've only probably been to 500 of them. And so I'm hoping to either win the lottery or be able to like manifest additional bodies or grab ideally a whole bunch of students and go into the field and spend time finding these other clues.
I was just saying because you'll be there doing more research because this is your first paper. So there are other forms of art also that you can focus on. So other wood carvings.
Yes.
There are many things.
Yes.
So that would be very beneficial for us.
And I didn't have time to talk about it, but if we end up having a little more time, I can pull up a few slides or a few images of what the wood carving looks like at Hidi Gompa, Hadin Gompa, that they took down, because I think it very much points to connections, that Sakya and Newar connection.
Anybody else? Yes, please.
To this, I recently did my undergraduate in English, and throughout your presentation, I noticed that there were a fair few instances of like a lot of these artworks being destroyed because of fires and because of many such reasons. So I was wondering at the condition of art conservation in Bhutan in general, and now that we know a fair bit about the link between Nepal and Bhutan in these art creations, is there such a link in art conservation as well, and even in modern times? So I was curious about that.
Thank you. Yes, the same like sort of climatic and geographic and seismic risks are still there. So fire, intentional and otherwise, earthquakes, landslides, all of these things do impact the material cultural heritage. I would state that the current state of Bhutan's conservation is rapidly expanding in its capacity. The Department of Culture has a dedicated group of persons who work primarily with documenting and conserving wall paintings, sculptures, and so on. There are also additional efforts through the National Library. For example, after an earthquake about 13 years ago, many of the clay sculptures that were damaged were in fact repaired at the National Library, and they also will recarve broken wood blocks, which is a very helpful exercise. And then just in the last year, an entire new institute called the Jung Dratsang Preservation and Antiquities Conservation Center, ZDPACC, has been launched, and that focuses purely on conservation of tanka, sculptures, ritual items, and other objects of material portable heritage that are associated with the Jumdratsam, which is the central monastic body. So there is a lot of growth, there has been a lot of growth. As an art historian, I think there's always room for more. I mean, there's always room for more people to be working with culture and preserving it and putting it in its best shape possible so that future generations will be able to access it in ways that the previous artisans and masters intended for us to see. Oh, and in terms of linkages, so far most of the work that I know, like when work is done in Tibet or done in Bhutan or done in Nepal, it's a combination of local experts. Sometimes an outside expert will come in. And I don't know of a broader formalized consortium or sort of network of people, but I think that would be something that as continued interest grows for the region, I think it would be wonderful if there were people who were working together to say, you know, like students from the school going in and saying, well, this is how we make it, and trying to work together that way. I think that would be lovely.
Great. At the back, yes.
Namaste, my name is.
And so that part of it is a broader coalition of people who are willing to contribute their knowledge, be credited, of course, and work together to fully flesh out a comprehensive art history of Bhutan. The second component of this is a collaborative project that I have with members of the Jumdratsang, or Central Monastic Body. There are 5 researchers, Jumdratsang coordinator, and myself, and we have a list of texts, and we are going through, and we are marking whenever we see the name of it, oh, this was consecrated, oh, somebody came from far away, this person's enthronement, and they gave a set of, 7 tanka. And so we are compiling information that way. The texts are generally, but not always, written in classical Tibetan, which in Bhutan they will reference as Chukye. I work in Chukye texts. I speak some Dzongkha. I understand it better than I speak it. And some texts are written in Dzongkha as well. We expect that there will be other texts. There are 19 languages of Bhutan. Beyond our initial list, which is mostly associated with people who were part of that structured, formal institution where classical Tibetan was the lingua franca, that we may have other sources appearing that are in other languages. If that arises, we'll be consulting experts in those other languages. Part of what we hope, so none of the texts that we're working with are in Nepali or Newari. So it would be great to have collaborators here in Nepal who can find similar references of when artists say, oh, and then I got a commission in Bhutan, and I got a commission here and there, and be willing to help co-create this knowledge together.
We also doing similar project, the same Fulbright project with Professor Bill from Middlebury. We are doing the exact similar process. We are doing 5 Pancha Buddha of Kathmandu Valley. So we are also now collecting digital handwritten manuscript of relating to art and 5 Buddhas. So we are also trying to collect the process, the Shastra content. Maybe we can share if there are some similar topics, like the creating of images,
Yes.
the processes,
Yes.
which would be useful to you. And maybe, who knows, we might find some artists, similar names, going to different places.
Yeah.
So we have just started, maybe after 2 weeks, we'll officially start that project. So we can collaborate
That would
and
be wonderful.
exchange the ideas.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Exciting.
No, one more thing, like this is others. So you said that there were no doubt that especially Nepalese never contribute art in Thai, Asia. So how are you gonna prove that like Nepalese never contributed in Bhutan by name only or by how you gonna say that? How you gonna like?
Yeah, so
Because I saw somewhere the Malla, Tarsi or something like 15th century. Its name is like more or less Nepalese name, no doubt. Only this is the difference, or other you use other sources also, like do you just prove that okay, Nepalese is contributed over there.
Yeah, so that's all we have, really. Since most of the artists don't sign it, I am so-and-so from so-and-so place, all we have are the textual records. And if the textual records say that this person or that person came from Nepal, and then the other evidence that we would have to look at is, does it look like it comes from Nepal? Do we see those characteristic elements, especially most visible in the throwbacks and the treatments of the face, where we can look and we can say, somebody from Nepal had something to do with this. So ultimately, we have to rely on the texts and the objects themselves. And oftentimes the artists aren't named. So we'll miss out on those, and then we can speculate through style and appearance that this person was either from Nepal or had contact with Nepalese modes of depiction, or Nepali modes of depiction. But then we have these, the other side of that is there are works that most of them are unsigned or very rarely. Sometimes you get this beautiful gift of this painting was made in this style for this person for this reason by this artist, but that's truly like a 1 in 100,000 experience. So we will definitely miss some out. Some of them will have to be, we believe that this was made by somebody of Newari or Nepali origin or heritage or had some training in that, but just by the nature, we're not going to get 100% of all the things made, unfortunately.
Most of the time, stylistic, because Newars, we are from Newar artist families. So most of the artists, they have very distinct style. So I can make out, we can make out as an artist and art historian, we can definitely make out the difference between Tibetan artists and Newar artists. Especially paintings is easier.
Painting is much easier, yeah.
Yes. But sculpture is difficult, but we still can make the difference. You need the eyes of an artist to make difference.
Great. Anybody else? Burning questions, curiosities?
I have a question which is maybe tangentially related. This may be a digression, but like considering the history of Newari artists, like usually when people travel to new places, there is also sometimes a tendency, people tend to maybe stay back or settle, right? And I'm now wondering, because I didn't know, and it's my own ignorance, but in more recent times, because of the tragedy of the Lotsampas who were expelled, is there some connection between the Lotsampas and the Newari artists from the 17th century? Did some of has there been, and how are they perceived in mainstream society? On one hand you have the well-respected artists and who contributed, and on the other hand, the Lotsampas were expelled, and to the current day, they continue to suffer. How do you feel about all this, and is there any traces, in the national conversation, discourse, perceptions?
Can you also introduce yourself, please?
Niranjan Kumar.
Thank you for the question. As far as I know, I have not seen any documents yet, and again, this project is early, that would link Newari itinerant artists with the population, the Lotsampas down in the south of Bhutan. My understanding is that was a much later development, that community grew almost more in my lifetime than that of the 17th century. My own research focuses on this nation building period, this Drukpa Kagyu identity period, and I'm just really not well informed enough to say, yes, there is a connection, or no, there is not a connection between these populations, but I appreciate the question, yes. Thank you.
Please.
My name is Malla. I have a couple of questions. You mentioned that some of the materials were brought in from here, the paint and stuff. Is that true for most of the material, like even copper and stuff? Is that locally sourced, or was it coming from different regions outside of Bhutan? And my second question is, do you know where the Nepali artists came from? Did they come from Idaho or south of the US?
Yeah, so in terms of from where the materials are brought, sometimes we get lucky. And for example, Tanjung Lakan, that temple I mentioned, it clearly says that the author's saying, that in fact it was, one of the Karmapas donated the paints and sent along a letter. And so sometimes they're saying, these materials came from an important person. In terms of how did Pansa Dewa get the copper and the gold, and how did they get the silver that they were using, I'm not sure yet. I'm hoping to be able to find some resources. We are fortunate that in the National Museum of Bhutan and in a few other sources, there are some taxation records. And I was thinking for a third phase, because this first phase is textual review, second phase, try and find as many as we can in the field. Third phase, going through the taxation records, because that will tell us how much metal is moving back and forth, hopefully. And that might be able to contribute another level of understanding. I know that many Bhutanese artists worked extensively in clay, which was abundantly domestically available, and they have more of a reputation for being as skilled with clay as Newars and Nepalis were with metal. The second one was the second question. Could you repeat that part, please?
Where the Nepali artists would have come from?
Via Tibet or by south?
All over the place, actually. There were a number of means of access into the region. So some were sort of coming from Sikkim. Some, we have like Gyaltse Tenzin Rabge in another section of the biography. He says like, we invited them from, I'm sorry, in Shadrin Halanambia's biography, it says, we invited the Newars from Tibet and Nepal. So that means the Newars that were invited were already in Tibet and they were just coming down, and then he was also inviting from Nepal. The exact paths, there are several passes along Bhutan's northern border that could have been access points. So it could have been through Khimsi, could have been through Bhutan, could have been through Kanaka, could have been through Paro, we're not really sure. But that is stuff that I'll keep an eye out for. Thanks for adding another thing to add to our form.
Great. More questions? Okay, another question while people get their thoughts together. I'm asking this because I simply don't know. Who funds you? Who funds this kind? I mean, there might be foundations and museums, yes, but I mean, my underlying question is, do you get federal grants? And is it being affected? But, you know, overall, like what is the scenario for, you know, funding historical research in, you know, in this kind of, these kind of areas? And who's funding your project?
Yeah, so
I mean,
in the
if it's
past,
okay to ask.
I've had project funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities. I've had funding from private foundations like the Kensei Foundation, which is thankfully still going strong. So the funding future, I'm not sure. Fortunately, the nature of my Fulbright for this year allowed me to make a significant contribution to project costs for these first phases. And then I'm going to be hitting the bricks with my grant applications and as much smiling as I can muster enthusiasm to try and fund later phases. We are hoping together that there will be enough information that comes out of this initial data pass that perhaps even the Jumdratsam, the central monastic body in Bhutan, or the Department of Culture may be willing to allocate a bit of budget towards the project. I would not take a salary from the project, you know, and the costs of doing research in the country are frankly comparatively low. From an outside perspective, so if I'm able to, or we are able to find the right donors, hopefully we'll be able to make a big impact. But I think funding for the humanities and the arts everywhere, whether it's the US or Bhutan or Nepal, is always a challenge. We always have to be a bit scrappier, a bit more creative, and maybe a little bit more on a lane of prayer than some of our colleagues in other disciplines.
But the foundations are going strong still, I mean, particularly in this area. Are there large foundations that would
There
fund
are a
research?
handful,
Okay.
there are a handful,
Great.
and some of them focus more on text, some of them
Right.
focus more on impact to understanding Buddhist history. There are different lenses
Right.
that they go through, and
Right.
so I'm interested and hopeful to see how it pans out. It's still a really dynamic time in the US and elsewhere.
Understand. Thank you.
If
Yes.
time permits, okay.
So you did mention that Tenzin Rabge was trying to consolidate political power by using religious rituals, right?
Mhm.
And you also mentioned for one of the answers that most Nepalis came through Tibet. So was like in this scenario, were Nepali artists simply looked at something that came through the economic understanding or like just as artistic value, or was there a political consequence to it as well?
Hmm. Interesting question. So I don't know that most of the artists Newari artists came from Tibet into Nepal. It was just one route. So some were coming directly from Nepal. Some may also have been coming from Ladakh or Sikkim, but we just haven't found those notations yet. So in terms of Tenzin Rabge's interest in consolidating power, he was doing that by building bridges between the Drukpa Kagyu and another dominant tradition in the rest of the country called Anima. I believe because artists from Nepal are consistently, seem to be very consistently called out as we got the artists from Nepal. I sort of feel like we got the artists from Nepal. You know, like they want to demarcate that as a point of pride and a testimony to the high quality of the work, especially for metal work. So that's the sense that I get, because other artists we have to figure out sort of by the prefix of their name sometimes, you know, because it might just be like, oh, Paro, you know, Paro Tashi, and then you know he's from Paro. But they don't say like featuring from Bhutan or featuring from Tibet, not always. But it seems when Nepali and Newari artisans are mentioned, it's pointing out that it's because it's going to be good work.
Great. अरूको कसैको छ तपाईको त्यो थाहा छ होइन, but anybody else? Perhaps I just before you, I was also thinking. You mentioned that you had other images that
Yes,
you
exactly.
could
I was
show,
just about
and
to-
maybe since we do have a little bit of time, and maybe you know there will be other questions coming up.
Can you give me a second?
Yeah, sure, sure.
So at the meantime, when she said about like Nepalese artists, you know, most of the Tibetan monastery, they take pride in having Nepalese artists, not just in Tibet, even in Ming Dynasty, Qing Dynasty,
Absolutely.
Nepalese artists were valued so much, so much. People don't read history. That's why we didn't, we don't know. But in Tibet, in China, most of the Silk Road, Nepalese artists were valued so much that they were treated excellently. And one person was Arnika. He was like
He's the only person we read about in history.
Jivarama sketchbook.
Jivarama, yeah.
I teach Jivarama to every single undergraduate class I have. I will teach Jivarama just because that sketchbook is just absolutely impeccable. And the students go bananas for it. They love it, like seeing the makara, seeing the naga, the nagini. Like sometimes on the exam, if they have a little extra time, I'll get some flourished makaras drawn in the margins or something like that. I do have a request before showing these images of the wooden sculpture. I don't have permission to show these publicly in terms of like broadcasting them out, but I think amongst us as a group, it's okay to show a few examples. Would it be okay to stop the live stream? Sorry to ask such a frank question, but I don't